Welcome to episode number 74 of Birthwords. In this week's podcast episode, I'm giving you a blast from the past, and I'm taking you back to the roots of the Birthwords podcast. I will be rebroadcasting episode number 1 that was originally aired on June 29th of 2019. Hi, and welcome to the first episode of the Birthwords podcast. In today's episode, I'll be telling the story of how the podcast came to be.
You're listening to the Birthwords podcast. Utah-based birth doula and applied linguistics scholar Sarah Pixton digs into the language of pregnancy and birth to help expectant women claim their power as life-giving agents engaged in a praiseworthy work. This podcast aims to promote positive birth paradigms and is not intended as medical advice.
Hi and welcome. Welcome to the first episode of the Birthwords podcast. I'm thrilled that you're listening. I'm so excited to tell a little bit about the journey that's gotten me here. And that's what we're going to do in this first episode. I'm going to give you a little background sneak peek into the work that I've been doing and what's in store in the future. So I'm so thrilled that you're here today. I wanted to start with a quote that I came across a couple of weeks ago by Gail Tolley, the midwife mastermind behind Spinning Babies. If you don't know what that is, look it up. You will not regret it. She encourages birth professionals to see birth as emergence, not emergency. And on this podcast, over the course of it, we'll talk a lot and hear stories about birth as emergence and birth as emergency. But today, I'm going to focus in on the story of a different kind of birth, the birth of this podcast, the emergence of birthwords. So going back a ways, I've always been interested in language. I was totally a grammar nerd as a teenager, because what teenager isn't? I was just like obsessed with parts of speech and punctuation. Don't get me wrong, I had like normal interests as well. But when I started college, I thought I was going to be an English major. I was going to minor in editing. And my mom gave me the book Eats, Shoots, and Leaves as a high school graduation / college beginning present. And I remember she wrote a caution on the inside about like not to be too enthusiastic in my quest to make the world a punctuationally perfect place. That was a while ago. And I ended up taking some classes in English language and towards the editing minor, and then realizing that I had a stronger passion for teaching and going that route. And as I got into teaching, and even in my college years before I was actually in the classroom, it became really apparent to me that the way that we speak as teachers makes a big difference in the lives of our students, in the ways that they perceive themselves as learners, which is a lifelong perception and an identity that they take with them that affects many of their choices that they make throughout their lives. So I studied elementary education as my undergrad, taught for a couple of years, and started having some babies. More on that in next episode. And after a few years, decided I wanted to get a master's degree in applied linguistics so that I could investigate and research and persuade teachers about the importance of their language. And so I did that. I started my master's program thinking that that was the application that I was going to use my applied linguistics master's degree for. But right around the time that I started my master's program, I got sucked into the birth world. Brief mention of the next upcoming episodes that I'll go into a lot more detail of my birth stories of my children. The first was twins and ended as an emergency C-section and was a difficult experience to recover from in a lot of ways. And then my second birth was a successful unmedicated VBAC that was completely empowering, paradigm shifting, and got me started on this adventure of birth work. And shortly after his birth, I decided I wanted to become a doula, and it's been an exciting adventure going forward. So I was kind of at this place, though, when my son was born, and I realized I had this passion for birth. And I was also working on my master's degree, thinking that I was going to apply it to education and at some point return to the classroom as a teacher. And I wasn't really sure where I was going with all of this. But I knew that both of my passions were important, so I kept going forward with both of them. And sometimes friends or family members would ask, like, okay, so do these things go together? Are you kind of giving up one and going towards the other? Are you still doing the master's program in linguistics? Are you still doing your birth work? And I was like, yeah, they're separate but interesting interests that I have, and I can't give up either one. So I'm just kind of doing both. And I remember even saying a few times, there is an intersection of the two where we could investigate the language that we use in birth and its effect, but I'm not really doing that right now. So that's kind of where it was for a while. And then one night, I woke up in the middle of the night and I just had this phrase in my mind, birth words, and I couldn't go back to sleep for a little while. I just had this idea stuck in my head and I didn't know what it meant, what I was going to do with it, except I knew that from that point on, I wanted to start blending those passions, and not just pursuing them as separate interests, and that I did want to use my study of linguistics and my work as a doula in combination together. And so I kind of let that sit for a while until some opportunities came up. One was that I am on the evidence-based birth professional email list, and I regularly get emails from Rebecca Decker of Evidence-Based Birth, as anybody who's on that list does. And she sent out a call for workshop proposals for their upcoming conference that's coming this September to Kentucky. And I saw the email and I thought, well, I have this idea that I was woken up in the middle of the night with, about birth words. So I'll write a workshop proposal and see what comes out. And, I got to work. I sat down and just pretty naturally out came a proposal for a 1-hour workshop that we could do where we, as birth professionals, would closely look at some birth stories, identify the language that's used that leads to positive experiences, and then the language that swayed the experience towards a more negative route. And then we would closely look at each of those instances from the different birth stories that we'd looked at and talk together about what do the positive things have in common, what underlying attributes are there linguistically and otherwise, and the negative ones, and how can we make sure that our language is that which leads toward positive experiences for these birth givers. And then we would do some role playing at the end to solidify and practice. And so I sent off my proposal and didn't think that I had too high of a chance of it being accepted because it was a new idea that was still forming really for me. But a little while later, I heard back that they wanted me to present a workshop at the conference. And I was totally thrilled and floored. And also realized that that meant I needed to make this idea more than just an idea and start doing things with it. And so I started planning workshops for birth professionals in my area. I'm in Provo, Utah, and there are tons of birth doulas within the area and in surrounding areas who are really, really awesome and passionate about bettering themselves all the time, attending workshops and trainings and really getting the information that they can to be the best supports that they can to their clients. And so I was working on a workshop for them, kind of intimidated by their awesomeness, but not as much so as I was the evidence-based birth conference, which was larger and something that I will be traveling for. But I just started getting to work on, okay, what does this workshop really look like? And I did a ton of reading and searching to find out who else has talked about birth and linguistics in any way. And there were not a ton who explicitly have. There are many researchers who have touched on it as they've kind of taken a social look of a social and cultural overview of birth in the history of America and other areas, and how different societal norms play into the birth experience, and language is a big part of that and has been touched on. There were a few who have looked specifically at the language that we use surrounding birth, but I feel like there needs to be a lot more. So I'm excited to be here to make that happen. In addition to the local workshops I've been doing and the national workshop that I'm preparing for the evidence-based birth conference, I have been working on trying to get some scholarly articles published, which is a big process. So I've got a couple of articles that are in utero, so to speak, just working on them and trying to find the right place to get them published. One is an ethnography. It's a sociolinguistic approach that looks closely from an insider's perspective at what it's like to support an unmedicated birth-giving woman in a hospital in the U.S. and uses a sociolinguistic framework to really break down what each aspect of communication is involved in that scenario. And then the other one is an extension of what I'm doing in my local workshops, an analysis of 15 different birth stories, looking closely at the language that is used, which is interesting because it's what's reported afterwards, not what was actually said. It's not a script of events as they actually occurred, but rather the author, the mother's perception of what was heard and how it was said and how it was received. And looking into what leads towards positive experiences and negatives, and what are the underlying beliefs and assumptions that come into play when we speak in the birth space. So I'm really excited to keep working on those and to keep planning workshops. I've also got upcoming workshops for expectant families where we talk about producing and receiving positive language during the birth experience, and more to come. But one of the things that I realized in the first workshop that I did with the birth professionals in my area is that the 60 minutes that I'd given for the workshop was far from enough time. So in addition to doing extensions on those workshops, I decided that it was time to start working on this podcast so that each week I can delve into a specific topic in some depth. So I am just thrilled to be starting this podcast. Every Monday, a new episode will be released. I'll be keeping it fairly short, at an average of about 15 minutes. And each week I'll dig into the language of pregnancy and childbirth. And my goal is going to be to empower expectant families with positive language. And both expectant families and those who support them, birth workers, care providers, nurses, family, friends, everyone is invited to listen. And I hope that you will join me each Monday as we talk about this. I'm also really interested in hearing your stories. If language played an important role in your birth, either positively or negatively, I would love to hear your story. So you can submit a request to have your story shared on the podcast on my website, www.summitbirthutah.com. summit.com/birthwords. So that's Summit, SUMMIT, birth, Utah.com/birthwords. I'll be back next Monday. Bye.
Did words play an important role in your birth experience? If you're interested in sharing your story on the podcast, go to summitbirthutah.com/birthwords. If you're liking what you hear on the podcast, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iTunes, or wherever you choose to listen. For more resources about harnessing the power of words to benefit the birth experience, visit summitbirthutah.com/birthwords.